There is a room in every palace that does not appear on any map. It has no name in the official records. No inventory of its contents was ever submitted to the royal steward. No servant who entered it was permitted to describe what they saw. The room existed. You can sense its outline in the gaps between documents, in the sudden silence of court diaries, in the way certain names vanish from correspondence mid-sentence, like a candle snuffed before it could finish burning. This is not a story about war. It is not a story about armies or treaties or the fall of kingdoms. It is a story about something quieter and far more dangerous. It is a story about what rulers did when they realized that the most lethal weapon in any palace was not a blade. It was a woman who had been paying attention. She sat in the inner chamber. She poured the wine. She stood behind the curtain while the council debated. She slept in the room next to the one where plans were made and alliances were broken and decisions were whispered into the dark. She heard everything. She remembered everything. And one morning, the ruler looked at her across the length of a polished table and understood with a cold and complete clarity that she knew too much. What happened next was rarely sudden. That is the first thing you need to understand. Rulers did not panic, they planned. And the measures they used to contain the women who knew their secrets were systematic, deliberate, and refined across centuries until they became almost invisible. Dressed in ceremony, wrapped in protocol, framed as protection, announced as honor. The architecture of power in any great court was never simply about who sat on the throne. It was about who stood closest to the throne and what they were permitted to know. Queen's consort navigated the impossible geometry of being both intimate and subordinate. Concubines moved through private corridors that no foreign ambassador ever saw. Ladies-in-waiting were selected for their family's political usefulness, assigned to the queen's chamber, and then, without anyone formally acknowledging it, became repositories of state intelligence. They overheard the arguments behind closed doors. They carried messages between figures who could not be seen speaking publicly. They observed the tremor in a king's hand when a particular subject arose, the way a minister's face went blank when a name was spoken. They learned to read the silences between official words. And in doing so, they became something no court could entirely afford and no ruler could entirely trust. This was the paradox at the center of every dynasty. To rule effectively, a monarch needed people close enough to trust with intimacy. But intimacy meant proximity, and proximity meant knowledge. The women in the inner circle were not merely decorative, they were functional. They managed the daily machinery of court life, maintained relationships with visiting dignitaries' wives, carried intelligence between households, preserved the social fabric that formal diplomacy could not reach. Their value was precisely their access, and their danger was exactly the same thing.
A court is not a building. It is an ecosystem. It operates through whisper networks as much as through formal decree. And in that ecosystem, women were often the most effective nodes of information, positioned where protocol placed them, trusted by those who underestimated them, and skilled at the kind of patient, relational intelligence gathering that no spy ring could manufacture. They did not need to be spies. They were simply present, and presence, sustained over years, accumulates into something that powerful men feared more than open opposition. Because open opposition can be defeated, it can be charged with treason, tried in a court, publicly executed, and used as a warning to others. But a woman who holds 10 years of a king's private history inside her memory, who knows which illness he concealed from his physicians, which child was not his, which alliance was built on a lie, which general was quietly paid to stand down, she cannot be defeated by a sword. She can only be managed, and management required a very different set of instruments. The stakes were never abstract. What these women knew had the potential to unmake dynasties. An illegitimate heir placed on a throne could be toppled the moment his origins became common knowledge. An affair between a queen and a foreign nobleman could provide legal and theological grounds for annulment, civil war, or foreign intervention. A hidden illness, a king's trembling hands, his darkening moods, his lost months of clarity, revealed to the wrong court physician or foreign ambassador, could trigger succession crises that shattered everything the ruler had spent his life constructing. One word spoken into the right ear at the right moment could be worth more than 10,000 soldiers. This is why the calculation was never about punishment. Punishment was secondary. The primary objective was silence, and there were many ways to achieve silence without producing a body, without triggering the political fallout of an execution, without creating the very scandal you were trying to prevent. The most elegant solution was always containment. In courts across centuries and civilizations, the architecture of containment was quietly perfected. A woman removed from court was not necessarily banished. She might be escorted with full honors to a palace wing that happened to be distant from the corridors of power, surrounded by servants who reported to the king's chamberlain rather than to her. She might be sent to a rural estate, described as a gift, framed as a retreat, celebrated as a mark of royal affection, and then simply never permitted to return. The doors were not locked from the outside. They did not need to be. The guards were not presented as jailers. They were presented as protection.
Religious seclusion served the same purpose with even greater efficiency. A woman entered a convent, a temple compound, a monastic estate, and the world was told she had chosen devotion. Perhaps she had, sometimes. Perhaps the walls she retreated behind were genuinely of her own construction, but in many documented cases, the timing of this retreat, immediately following a political crisis, immediately after a succession dispute, immediately in the wake of a royal marriage or a royal divorce, was too precise to be coincidence. The institutions of faith were, in practice, also institutions of custody, and they provided the ruler with something invaluable, a moral narrative. She had chosen God over the world. Who could argue with that? Luxury was weaponized in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from the outside. When the cage is gilded, when the meals are exquisite, when the servants are attentive and the gardens are beautiful and the linens are embroidered silk, the captivity becomes almost invisible, even to the captive. This was deliberate. A woman kept in comfortable confinement could not easily describe herself as a prisoner without sounding ungrateful, without appearing unstable, without opening herself to the charge that she had rejected honor in favor of grievance. The comfort was not generosity, it was strategy. It produced docility without requiring violence, and maintained appearances without requiring explanation. But there was another method of silencing that was even more total, even more efficient, because it did not merely remove the woman from power, it removed her from the equation entirely. It sent her somewhere she could not return from, into a life so thoroughly disconnected from the court she had known that her knowledge became practically irrelevant, her testimony practically unreachable. The instrument was marriage. Not all political marriages were acts of silencing. Many were straightforward instruments of alliance, the standard mechanism of diplomacy in every era. But there was a particular category of marriage, arranged hastily, finalized without the woman's visible consent, concluded with a man whose primary qualification was loyalty to the crown, that served a purpose beyond alliance. It was controlled displacement. It moved the dangerous woman out of the capital, out of the court, out of the conversation, and placed her in a household where her husband's first obligation was to the ruler rather than to her. She was not killed, she was relocated, permanently. The genius of this method was that it required no scandal to execute. It even produced celebration. There were banquets, gifts, blessings. The woman was congratulated. She was sent away with ceremony and goodwill, and the court turned its attention to other matters. And within a year or two, the dangerous things she had known were no longer current, no longer politically useful, no longer worth the risk of speaking aloud. By the time she might have found someone willing to listen, the moment had passed. History had moved on without her.
But erasure was not merely physical. It was literary. It was archival. It was conducted in libraries and scriptoriums and official record offices with the same cold deliberation as exile, and it left wounds that proved far more durable than exile. Because exile can be reversed, but the destruction of a record is permanent. Names were removed from stone inscriptions, faces were painted over in official portraiture, busts were recarved. In documents where a woman's name appeared, later scribes were instructed to leave the space blank, to replace the name with a title or a circumlocution, to render her presence grammatically invisible. Letters she had written were confiscated before they could be copied or distributed. Correspondence she had received was burned or sealed in archives that would not be opened for centuries, by which point the political urgency of their contents had dissolved into mere academic curiosity. Chronicles commissioned by the ruler's successors simply omitted her. Not actively, not dramatically, she was not written out with obvious hostility that a later reader might notice. She was simply not written in. And absence, unlike presence, does not demand explanation. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire system. The violence of erasure is invisible from the inside. It leaves no scar that a later observer can point to and say, here is where she was removed. There is only the gap, the inexplicable gap in the record, the name that appears in one document and then never again, the letter that references a conversation with no surviving counterpart, the portrait that shows a queen surrounded by women whose faces have been replaced by flat pigment. The silence is the evidence. And silence, by definition, says nothing about itself. Yet the system was not perfect. History has a persistent habit of recording the things it was supposed to suppress, usually by accident, usually in documents nobody thought important enough to destroy. And what those accidental records reveal is that the women contained by these strategies did not always accept their containment passively. Confinement, if you are intelligent enough and patient enough, is not a complete neutralization. It is merely a change of venue. A woman placed in a remote estate still had servants who moved through the broader world. A woman placed in religious seclusion still had access to the networks of faith, to abbesses, to visiting clergy, to the women who came to pray and lingered to talk. A woman exiled through marriage still had her own household, her own correspondence, her own relationships with families whose interests did not always align with the rulers. The walls that were meant to contain also, paradoxically, created a space of relative privacy. And private space, in the hands of someone who understood information and patience, could become a workspace. Secret correspondence networks were maintained across distances that should have made them impossible. Women in confinement found intermediaries, loyal servants, sympathetic religious figures, merchants whose routes passed through both the capital and the estate, and used them to sustain political relationships that the ruler believed he had severed. Intelligence continued to flow. Influence continued to extend. Succession disputes were quietly shaped by women whose formal political existence had been terminated. The ruler had removed the piece from the board. He had not removed the player.
In some cases, the knowledge these women carried became, in confinement, more powerful than it had been at court, because now it was scarce. Now it was held by someone with nothing to lose. Now it could be offered as currency to parties who might otherwise never have had access to it. The isolation that was meant to neutralize had, in certain hands, produced something closer to leverage. The ruler had not silenced her, he had simply changed the terms of her silence. There were cases where no amount of management was sufficient, where the knowledge was too specific, the woman too connected, the network too established, the risk too acute to be contained by comfort or exile or marriage or silence. In those cases, rulers reached for the instrument of last resort, but they rarely reached for it directly. That would have been too visible, too destabilizing, too likely to produce the very scandal it was meant to prevent. Instead, there were trials, accusations carefully constructed around moral or religious categories, categories that deflected attention from political threat and redirected public focus toward transgression of a different kind. She was accused of infidelity, of witchcraft, of heresy, of conspiracy. The charges were designed not merely to justify execution, but to perform a particular kind of erasure in advance, to recast the woman's identity so completely that even those who had known her began to question what they remembered. The trial was not a search for truth, it was a rewriting, and the execution that followed was not a punishment, it was a full stop, placed at the end of a sentence that had already been revised beyond recognition. Even after death, the management continued. The official narrative was circulated, the verdict was read in public places, distributed in chronicles, confirmed by church or state as appropriate. The woman died not merely physically but rhetorically. She was made into an example, not of power's cruelty, but of the consequences of transgression. Future women in positions of proximity to power received the message with absolute clarity. They understood what knowing too much looked like from the outside. They understood the particular category of danger they lived inside. And some of them, for the sake of survival, chose not to remember what they had heard, or not to speak it, or to speak it only in the form of prayer, in the silence of private grief, in the locked rooms of their own minds where no official record could reach. Understanding what these methods achieved requires looking beneath their practical surface into the psychology that made them so durable across so many different societies and eras. Isolation did not merely prevent communication, it dismantled the relational architecture through which a person maintains their sense of reality. A woman removed from court lost not just her political network, but her witnesses, the people who had been present when things were said and done, who could confirm what she remembered, who could give her memory the social validation that transforms private knowledge into public testimony. Without witnesses, memory becomes uncertain. Without allies, truth becomes fragile. The isolation was an epistemological weapon as much as a logistical one.
Dependency was cultivated deliberately. A woman whose access to food, warmth, safety, and dignity depended entirely on the continued goodwill of the ruler was a woman who understood, without needing to be told, that her survival was contingent on compliance. The luxury of confinement was not a gift, it was a demonstration of what could be withdrawn. And that constant, unspoken awareness that everything comfortable in her life existed at someone else's discretion created a form of obedience more reliable than any chain, because it lived inside her rather than around her. The weaponization of honor and reputation operated with equal efficiency. A woman's social standing, her value as a mother, a wife, a daughter, a woman of faith and dignity, was not merely personal, it was political. It determined who would speak on her behalf, who would shelter her, who would carry her messages, who would believe her if she tried to tell what she knew. A ruler who could damage a woman's reputation did not need to imprison her body. He had imprisoned her credibility, which in many ways was more complete. She could speak all she wanted. Nobody of consequence would listen. The social architecture of shame was as effective as any stone wall. This is the psychological core of the entire system. The methods varied across cultures and centuries. The instruments changed, the vocabulary shifted, but the underlying logic remained constant. It was not enough to remove the woman from power, it was necessary to remove power from the woman. And that required not just physical management, but the dismantling of everything that made her dangerous: her networks, her credibility, her memory's relationship to the public record, her access to anyone who might act on what she knew. The goal was not her death. The goal was her irrelevance. Death was merely the final instrument when irrelevance had failed. The rooms that held these women have mostly been demolished. The estates have changed hands a dozen times. The convents have been repurposed or left to ruin. The portraits have been restored incorrectly by well-meaning archivists who did not know what had been painted over. The letters that survived, the ones that slipped past the confiscations, that were buried in monastery walls or sewn into garment linings or copied by loyal servants in secret, those letters now sit in climate-controlled archives, cataloged under subject headings that rarely mention their full significance. Historians examine them with careful professional neutrality. They note the dates, they note the handwriting, they note the references to people and events that other documents never mention. They note the gaps. This is what power does with the things it cannot destroy. It does not acknowledge them. It does not argue with them. It allows them to exist in the faint margin of the official record, where they are technically preserved but practically invisible, accessible only to those patient enough to look and brave enough to ask why the record stopped exactly there, at exactly that moment, in exactly that voice.
The women who lived inside these systems knew what was happening to them. This is important. They were not always deceived. They understood the shape of the cage even when it was furnished as a palace. They understood that the marriage was not a celebration. They understood that the convent was not a retreat. They understood that the guards were not there to protect them. They understood all of this, and in many cases they endured it with a composure that those who confined them perhaps never expected. A composure rooted not in acceptance, but in its opposite, in the quiet, sustained refusal to be entirely defined by what had been done to them. Some of them wrote, not for publication, not for posterity in any formal sense, but because the act of writing is itself a form of resistance, a declaration that the experience was real, that the memory was accurate, that the erasure was incomplete. Some of what they wrote survived, most did not, but even the fragments that remain carry inside them something that centuries of official silence could not extinguish: the exact, precise, undeniable weight of a woman who knew what she knew and knew that she knew it and chose to preserve that knowledge in whatever form she could, in whatever time she had, against whatever machinery was brought to bear against her. They wrote in margins. They wrote on the backs of prayer texts that nobody thought to confiscate. They wrote in the language of allegory when direct language was too dangerous, encoding what they had witnessed inside devotional poetry, inside domestic correspondence, inside lists of household accounts, where a single strange entry might carry more historical weight than a formal chronicle. They found the cracks in the system and pressed words into them, not loudly, not recklessly, but persistently, with the particular patience of someone who understands that survival and memory are the same act performed in different registers. In palaces built of stone, the most dangerous walls were not around the kingdom, they were around the truth. And the women who lived inside those walls understood something that the rulers who built them never fully grasped: that a truth contained is not a truth destroyed, it is a truth waiting. It is a truth that outlasts the system that imprisoned it, that surfaces in the margins of documents never meant to survive, in the names recorded by mistake, in the letters sealed without being burned, in the spaces between the official words where something real was always quietly still breathing. The rulers built systems of silence that spanned decades. The women built something smaller and more durable: a single sentence, a folded letter, a name scratched into plaster beneath a whitewashed wall. The systems have mostly crumbled. Some of the sentences remain. They were not kept silent because they were powerless. They were kept silent because they were not.